I never imagined I'd have to hire a private investigator to prove my own property line, but there I was, watching through my security cameras as my neighbor tried to secretly install a swimming pool on my land. Sometimes the craziest stories are the ones happening in your own backyard, literally. If you had told me 6 months ago that I'd be caught in the middle of a suburban warfare over a swimming pool, I would have laughed it off. As a software developer, I deal with logic and clear-cut solutions every day. Property lines should be simple, black and white, just like the code I write. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I moved into my dream home in Maple Grove subdivision. Before we dive into this wild story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this all unfolds. And if you've ever dealt with a nightmare neighbor, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your stories. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and until recently, my life revolved around debugging code and dreaming about owning a home with enough space for a garden. After years of saving every penny from my software development job, I finally found it. A beautiful colonial-style house in Riverside Heights with a spacious backyard that seemed perfect for my plans to create an organic vegetable garden and maybe even build a small greenhouse. The property wasn't just a house. It was everything I'd worked for since graduating college. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and most importantly, a 1/4-acre lot that backed up to a small wooded area. It was the kind of place where you could actually see the stars at night, away from the harsh glare of city lights. The previous owners had maintained it meticulously, and the moment I walked through the front door, I knew this was it. This was home. My real estate agent, Emily Parker, couldn't stop gushing about what a great deal it was. "Sarah, properties like this in Maple Grove don't come up often," she told me during the final walkthrough, "especially with this much land. The fact that it's fully surveyed and has updated property markers is a huge plus." I remember nodding along, barely registering what she was saying about property markers and surveys. I was too busy imagining where I'd plant my tomatoes and calculating how long it would take to convert the spare bedroom into a home office. In hindsight, I should have paid more attention to those details. They would become crucially important, sooner than I could have ever expected. The closing process went smoothly, almost too smoothly looking back. I got approved for a mortgage with a great interest rate. The home inspection came back clean, and before I knew it, I was standing in my new kitchen, surrounded by moving boxes and that particular kind of silence that only comes with being alone. In your own home for the first time, the first few weeks were like living in a dream. I set up my home office overlooking the backyard, where I could watch squirrels chase each other across the grass during my video calls. I started planning my garden, marking out spots for raised beds and researching which vegetables would grow best in our climate zone. I even joined the neighborhood Facebook group where everyone seemed friendly and welcoming. Well, almost everyone. I first noticed something was off during my morning coffee routine. I like to start my day early, usually around 6 a.m., taking my coffee out to the back porch to watch the sunrise. It was during one of these peaceful moments that I spotted her, Linda Thompson, standing at her back window, binoculars in hand, staring intently at something in my yard. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she was birdwatching. The neighborhood did have an impressive variety of cardinals and blue jays, but then I noticed it happening more frequently. She would be out in her yard, measuring things with a tape measure, making notes on a clipboard, always when she thought no one was watching. It wasn't until I met Tom Wilson, my elderly neighbor on the other side, that I started to understand what might be brewing. Tom was a retired architect who had lived in Maple Grove for over 30 years. He caught me one evening as I was checking my mailbox. "You're the new owner at 425 Maple Drive, right?" he asked, leaning on his cane. When I nodded, he glanced around before lowering his voice. "Just a friendly heads up. You might want to double-check your property surveys. Linda next door has been, let's say, creative with property lines in the past. I laughed it off at the time. After all, I had all the proper documentation. The property lines were clearly marked. What could possibly go wrong? That's when Tom dropped the bombshell that made my stomach sink. Did you know she's been trying to get approval for an in-ground pool for the past 3 years? The HOA keeps denying her permit because her lot is too small for the size pool she wants. But Linda doesn't take no for an answer. I thanked Tom for the warning, but inside, my mind was already racing. Those measurements she'd been taking. The way she kept studying my yard. It all started to make sense, but surely, I thought, no one would be bold enough to try to build a pool on someone else's property. Right? Wrong. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut when I first saw her out there with those binoculars. I should have taken Tom's warning more seriously, because what happened next would turn my peaceful suburban dream into a nightmare that would involve private investigators, security cameras, and a showdown that would divide our entire neighborhood. But before I tell you how I caught Linda trying to secretly install a swimming pool on my property, let me explain exactly how things escalated to that point. Because trust me, this story gets wild. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves as I settled into my new routine at Maple Grove. My home office was finally set up perfectly, with the desk positioned to catch the morning light streaming through the bay windows. I'd spent countless hours researching gardening techniques and had even started preparing the soil for my future vegetable garden. Life felt like it was falling perfectly into place. Every morning, I'd wake up before sunrise, brew my favorite Colombian coffee, and head out to my back porch. There was something magical about watching the sky transform from inky black to soft purple, then to brilliant orange. The morning dew would glisten on the grass, and the chirping of early birds created a peaceful symphony. This was exactly what I dreamed of when I bought this house, a slice of tranquility away from the chaos of city life. I'd already mapped out where each raised bed would go in my garden. The southern corner would be perfect for tomatoes and peppers, while the eastern edge would house my herb garden. I'd even ordered heritage seeds from a local organic farm and started some seedlings indoors. The previous owners had left behind a charming garden shed that I was slowly organizing with tools and supplies. My neighbors, for the most part, seemed welcoming. Maria Rodriguez, who lived 3 houses down, brought over a homemade apple pie one evening. We chatted about the neighborhood, and she mentioned how everyone gathered for block parties twice a year. David Chen, the HOA president, stopped by to welcome me and provide a thick binder of community guidelines. He seemed particularly proud of how well-maintained all the properties were. But then there was Linda Thompson. At first, her behavior seemed merely odd. She'd be out in her yard at strange hours, always with that clipboard and tape measure. Sometimes I'd catch her taking photos of my property line when she thought I wasn't looking. Her tiny Yorkshire Terrier Princess would yap incessantly whenever I stepped into my backyard. One Saturday morning, as I was setting up my sprinkler system, I noticed Linda and her friend Grace Sullivan huddled together on Linda's back porch. They were pointing at various spots in my yard, whispering and making notes. Grace kept nodding enthusiastically while Linda gestured expansively, as if she were describing something grand. My curiosity got the better of me, and I casually walked closer to my property line, pretending to check the soil quality. That's when I overheard fragments of their conversation that made my blood run cold. The deep end would be perfect right there, Linda was saying, pointing to a spot well within my property, and we could extend the shallow end this way with the pool house tucked behind those trees. But Linda, Grace replied, her voice hesitant, isn't that beyond your property line? Linda waved her hand dismissively. Oh, that old survey is wrong. Everyone knows it. Besides, What's she going to do with all that space? She's single, no kids, it's practically wasteful. I stood there, frozen, dirt crumbling between my fingers. Was she seriously planning to build a pool that would extend into my property? Surely this was just idle dreaming. No one would actually attempt something so brazen. That evening, I pulled out all my property documentation. Emily had been right. Everything was meticulously documented. The survey markers were clear, and my property line extended a good 30 feet beyond where Linda seemed to think it ended. I even found photos from the previous owner showing the exact locations of the property stakes. Just to be safe, I decided to email David Chen about the HOA's pool installation policies. His response was prompt and clear. Any major construction project, including pools, required HOA approval and proper permits from the city.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Linda Thompson had been denied pool permits 3 times in the past year due to lot size restrictions. The next few days passed quietly, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Linda's behavior became more obvious. She started having what looked like contractors visit her house. They would stand in her yard, pointing and measuring, occasionally stepping onto my property when they thought I wasn't watching. I decided to install security cameras. It felt paranoid, but something about the situation made me uneasy. I opted for a high-end system with night vision and motion detection. The installation company finished setting everything up on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, I was glad I had. At 6:45 a.m., while I was on a video call with my development team, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I glanced at the feed and nearly choked on my coffee. There was Linda, accompanied by 2 men in construction gear, walking around my backyard with measuring tools and spray paint. They were marking lines on my grass, speaking in hushed tones and consulting what looked like blueprints. I immediately ended my call and rushed outside. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" Linda turned, her face a mask of innocence. "Oh, Sarah. Good morning. We're just doing some preliminary work for my pool installation." "Don't worry, it won't affect you at all." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. The audacity was stunning. "Linda, this is my property. You're at least 20 feet past your property line." She laughed, a high, tinkling sound that set my teeth on edge. "Oh, sweetie, no. The property line extends much further than you think. I've lived here for 15 years. I think I know where my land ends." The contractors looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. I pulled out my phone and pulled up photos of my survey documents. "Actually, I have the official survey right here. You're well into my property. Please leave immediately, or I'll have to call the police." Linda's friendly facade cracked slightly. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice took on a sharp edge. "Listen. Here, you don't understand how things work in this neighborhood. I've been planning this pool for years, and I'm not about to let some newcomer ruin everything. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." The contractors exchanged glances, clearly wanting no part of this confrontation. One of them spoke up. "Ma'am, if there's a property dispute, we'll need to halt any planning until it's resolved." Linda whirled on them. "There is no dispute. I'm telling you, this is my property." Her voice had risen to a shrill pitch that brought several curious neighbors to their windows. I stood my ground, though my heart was racing. "Linda, I have security cameras recording everything right now. Please leave my property immediately." She stared at me for a long moment, her face flushed with anger. Finally, she turned to the contractors. "We'll reschedule. I'll get this sorted out." As she stormed off, she turned back to me. "This isn't over. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The contractors apologized awkwardly before hurrying away, leaving me standing in my backyard, still trying to process what had just happened. I immediately called Emily Parker, my real estate agent, and explained the situation. She was horrified, but not entirely surprised. "Sarah, document everything," she advised. "Take photos of any marks they made on your property, save the security camera footage, and whatever you do, don't let her bully you into giving up any of your land." I spent the rest of the day taking photos and videos of my property line, the survey markers, and the spray paint marks Linda's contractors had left behind. I also noticed something disturbing. Some of the original property stakes appeared to have been tampered with, shifted slightly from their original positions. That evening, Tom Wilson came by to check on me. He'd seen the morning's confrontation from his window. "Be careful," he warned. "Last year, Linda tried to claim part of the Johnsons' driveway was actually hers. She's persistent, and she's got friends on the city council." I nodded, but inside, my mind was already racing. If Linda had friends in high places, I needed to be prepared for a fight. I started researching property lawyers and found James Cooper, who specialized in property disputes. His online reviews were excellent, with several mentions of successful cases against aggressive neighbors. As I sat on my back porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I could see Linda pacing in her backyard, talking angrily on her phone. Her Yorkshire Terrier yapped at a squirrel, the sound echoing through the otherwise quiet neighborhood. The peace I'd felt just days ago seemed like a distant memory. I knew this was just the beginning. Linda's threat, "This isn't over," kept replaying in my mind. She'd been denied her pool multiple times, and now she was desperate enough to try to steal my land, but I wasn't about to let that happen. I'd worked too hard for this home, this piece of paradise, to let anyone take even an inch of it away from me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the security camera feeds on my phone, half expecting to see construction equipment rolling onto my property in the darkness. The moon cast long shadows across my backyard, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. But I wasn't just afraid, I was angry. Angry that someone would be so entitled as to think they could simply take what wasn't theirs. I spent hours organizing my documentation, creating a timeline of events, and saving backup copies of everything to my cloud storage. I even started a detailed log of every interaction with Linda, including times, dates, and witnesses. Something told me I was going to need all of it. As I finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the first skirmish in what was about to become a full-scale suburban war. Linda Thompson had no idea what she'd started, but I was ready to fight for every square inch of my property. After all, this wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who thought she could take whatever she wanted. Little did I know the next few weeks would test my resolve in ways I never imagined. Linda's failed attempt to secretly mark my yard for her pool was just the beginning. She was about to escalate things to a level that would involve not just the HOA and the police, but would ultimately divide the entire neighborhood. But for now, I had documentation, security cameras, and the truth on my side. I was going to need all three. The morning after the confrontation with Linda and her contractors, my security cameras caught something that made my stomach turn. At precisely 5:47 a.m., before the sun had even risen, a shadowy figure was moving around my property line. Even in the dim light, I could make out Linda's distinctive silhouette as she methodically worked her way along the boundary, doing something to my property markers. I threw on a jacket and rushed outside, phone in hand already recording. The motion-activated floodlights kicked in as I approached, illuminating Linda like a deer in headlights. She was kneeling beside one of my property stakes, a hammer and what looked like a new stake in her hands. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I called out, my voice cutting through the pre-dawn silence. Linda jumped, dropping the hammer, with a dull thud on the dewy grass. "Oh, Sarah, I was just fixing these old markers. They're clearly in the wrong place," she replied, brushing dirt from her designer workout pants as she stood. The casual way she said it, as if tampering with property markers was as normal as watering flowers, made my blood boil. Linda, you need to leave right now. Tampering with property markers is a criminal offense. I kept my phone steady, recording everything. I have you on video attempting to move these stakes. Her face contorted into an expression of righteous indignation. These markers are wrong. I've lived here for 15 years, and I know exactly where my property ends. You can't just move in and change everything. As we argued, lights began, flicking on in neighboring houses. I could see curtains twitching as curious neighbors watched the early morning drama unfold. Tom Wilson had emerged onto his front porch, phone in hand, presumably ready to call for help if needed. I'm calling the police, I stated firmly, already dialing 911. This is criminal trespassing and tampering with property markers. Linda's expression shifted from indignation to panic. You wouldn't dare. Do you have any idea who my husband is? Kevin is on the city council. You're making a huge mistake. But I was already speaking with the dispatcher, calmly explaining the situation while keeping my camera trained on Linda. She paced back and forth, alternating between threats and attempts at rationalization. You're being ridiculous. I'm just trying to correct an obvious mistake. The previous owners understood how things worked here. Her voice had taken on a shrill edge that echoed through the quiet morning air. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up, its lights casting eerie blue patterns across the houses. Officer Amanda Foster stepped out, looking between Linda and me with practiced neutrality. What seems to be the problem here? She asked, though the property stakes and hammer lying on the ground told most of the story. I played the security, footage for Officer Foster, showing Linda's early morning activities. I also pulled up the official property survey on my phone, demonstrating where the markers should be. Linda launched into an elaborate explanation about how the surveys were wrong, how she'd been promised more property by the previous owners, and how I was being unreasonable about sharing the space for her pool. Officer Foster listened patiently, then turned to Linda. Ma'am, tampering with property markers is a serious offense. I'm going to have to ask you to come down to the station to make a statement. The color drained from Linda's face. But I'm friends with Captain Richards. We play golf together. That's nice, ma'am, but it doesn't change the law. Please come with me. As Officer Foster escorted a protesting Linda to the patrol car, more neighbors had gathered to watch. Maria Rodriguez approached me, shaking her head. I can't believe she would go this far, Maria said quietly, though maybe I should. Last summer, she tried to claim the Andersons' garden shed was partially on her property, had a surveyor come out and everything. I spent the next few hours documenting everything, taking photos of the disturbed markers, saving multiple copies of the security footage, and making detailed notes about the encounter. James Cooper, my property lawyer, had already scheduled an emergency consultation for later that morning. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Grace Sullivan, Linda's usual ally, stopped by under the pretense of borrowing sugar, but I could tell she was fishing for details. Linda's just passionate about her pool project, Grace said, stirring her coffee at my kitchen counter. She's been planning it for years. Surely you could work something out. Maybe lease her some land. I stared at her, incredulous. She tried to steal my property by moving boundary markers. That's not passion, that's criminal behavior. Grace shifted uncomfortably. Well, you have to understand, Linda's used to getting her way. Her husband Kevin being on the city council, it's given her certain expectations. That afternoon, I met with James Cooper in his downtown office. He reviewed my documentation with growing interest. This is actually perfect, he said, spreading the papers across his desk. We have clear video evidence of attempted property marker tampering, multiple witnesses, and a police report. Linda Thompson's influence won't help her here. He explained that we needed to act quickly and decisively. People like this don't stop easily. We need to file for an immediate injunction to prevent any further attempts at construction or property tampering. As we discussed strategy, my phone buzzed with a text from David Chen, the HOA president. Linda's husband Kevin had apparently called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss property line standardization in the neighborhood. They're trying to use the HOA to legitimize their land grab, James said, shaking his head. Classic move, but it won't work. The HOA can't override legal property boundaries. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Kevin Thompson himself, looking considerably less confident than his wife, stood on my front porch. "Sarah, I hope we can handle this situation diplomatically," he began, his politician's smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Linda can be enthusiastic about her projects, but I'm sure we can reach an arrangement that benefits everyone." I remained in my doorway, security camera recording everything. "The only arrangement I'm interested in is your wife respecting my property rights and dropping this absurd pool scheme." Kevin's smile faltered. "Look, I'm trying to be reasonable here. Linda's been through a lot lately, and this pool means everything to her. Maybe we could discuss some kind of compensation." "Are you trying to bribe me, Councilman Thompson?" I asked quietly. He backpedaled quickly. No, of course not. Just exploring options between neighbors." He retreated to his car, but not before adding, "Think about it. Things could get very complicated if we have to involve city zoning regulations." I immediately called James and reported the conversation. He wasn't surprised. "Document everything," he advised. "Kevin Thompson just implicitly threatened to abuse his position on the city council. That's going to look great in court if we need it." The next morning, I woke to find my yard had been transformed into a circus. Sometime during the night, Linda had hired a landscaping crew to accidentally mow well into my property, creating a clear line where she claimed the boundary should be. The crew was still there when I went outside, their trucks parked along the street with Thompson Landscape Design emblazoned on the sides. Linda stood supervising, a triumphant smile on her face. "Oh, good morning, Sarah," she called out, sickeningly sweet. "I hope you don't mind. I noticed your grass was getting a bit long, so I had my crew take care of it. They just followed the natural property line, of course." I pulled out my phone and started recording again. "Linda, this is trespassing. Again. And now you're damaging my property." "I'm improving it," she protested. "And this is my property. I have documentation to prove it." "Show me," I challenged. She waved vaguely toward her house. "I don't have to show you anything. I know where my property ends." The landscaping crew looked increasingly uncomfortable. The foreman approached me cautiously. "Ma'am, Mrs. Thompson told us this was all her property. If there's a dispute..." I showed him the official survey on my phone. His eyes widened slightly, and he quickly signaled his crew to pack up. "Hey, where are you going?" Linda demanded. "I'm paying you to finish this job." "Sorry, ma'am, we don't get involved in property disputes. You'll have to sort this out legally first." Linda's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Don't you dare leave. I'll have your business license revoked. Kevin will make sure of it." The crew left anyway, leaving Linda standing in my partially mowed yard, shaking with rage. Neighbors had once again gathered to watch the spectacle, and I could hear murmurs of disapproval, though whether directed at Linda or me, I couldn't tell. Maria Rodriguez approached me as Linda stormed back to her house. "Sarah, you need to be careful. Linda's not going to stop. And she's got friends in the Historical Society too. They could make things very difficult for any changes you want to make to your property." I spent the rest of the morning on the phone, first with James Cooper, then with Officer Foster to file another report, and finally with a local surveyor to document the current state of my property lines. The surveyor, an older gentleman named Frank Martinez, arrived that afternoon. 30 years I've been doing this job, he said as he set up his equipment, and I've never seen someone so determined to move a property line through sheer force of will. As Frank worked, Linda emerged from her house again, this time with Grace Sullivan and two other women I didn't recognize. They stood in a group on her porch, pointing and talking animatedly. "Looks like she's rallying the troops," Frank commented dryly. "You might want to prepare yourself. In my experience, this is when things really start getting interesting." He was right. Little did I know, Linda was about to escalate this conflict to a level that would involve not just the police and the HOA, but would ultimately require intervention from state authorities. Her early morning attempt to move my property markers was just the beginning of a campaign that would test the limits of both law and neighborly relations in Maple Grove. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as I sat in my home office, trying to focus on a crucial software deadline. But my attention kept drifting to the security camera feeds displayed on my second monitor. Linda's latest move had been to organize what she called a neighborhood beautification committee meeting, conveniently scheduled in her backyard, where everyone could get a good look at the property line in question. Through my window, I could see a gathering of about 15 neighbors, all clutching glasses of iced tea and listening intently as Linda gestured dramatically toward my yard. Grace Sullivan stood beside her, nodding enthusiastically and taking notes on an iPad. The whole scene reminded me of a general rallying troops for battle. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria Rodriguez. "Heads up, Linda's telling everyone. You're trying to destroy property values by preventing community improvements. She's circulating a petition." I was about to respond when my security system pinged with an alert. The cameras caught two men in business suits walking along my property line, taking photographs and measurements. They weren't the usual contractors. These men looked more official, and they carried clipboards with what appeared to be government letterhead. Throwing professionalism to the wind, I abandoned my video conference mid-sentence and rushed outside. As I approached, I could hear Linda's voice carrying across the yard. "See, I told you the survey markers were all wrong. Just look at how the land naturally flows." The men turned as I approached. One of them, a tall gentleman with graying temples, stepped forward. "Good afternoon. I'm Richard Montgomery from the City Planning Department, and this is my colleague, Jason Wright. We're here to investigate a complaint about potential zoning violations." My heart sank. So this was Kevin Thompson's doing, using his city council connections to bring in the zoning department. I maintained my composure and retrieved my property documentation from inside. "I have all the relevant permits and surveys right here," I said, pulling up the files on my tablet, including the original plot plans from when the subdivision was first developed. Richard Montgomery examined the documents with professional interest, while his colleague continued taking photographs. Linda hovered nearby, interjecting comments about historical property lines and community standards. "Mrs. Thompson," Montgomery said finally, "these documents appear to be in order. The current property lines are consistent with the original subdivision plans." Linda's face flushed. "But that's impossible. I have documentation from the previous owners that clearly shows—" "Ma'am," Montgomery interrupted gently, "any private agreements with previous owners wouldn't override the official property records. If you believe there's an error, you'll need to file a formal dispute with the county assessor's office." As the zoning officials left, Linda's beautification committee had gravitated closer to watch the exchange. I could hear murmurs of conversation, and not all of it seemed sympathetic to Linda's cause anymore. That's when Linda played her next card. "Well, if that's how you want to play this, Sarah," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I suppose you leave me no choice but to inform the Historical Society about your unauthorized gardening plans." I stared at her, momentarily confused. My vegetable garden plans were completely within HOA guidelines, but before I could respond, Linda had pulled out her phone and was speaking rapidly to someone. "Yes, Margaret? It's Linda Thompson. You know that lovely Victorian-era property at 425 Maple Drive. The new owner is planning to destroy the historical landscape with modern additions. Yes, it's terrible. The historical character of the whole neighborhood could be compromised." No. Over the next few hours, my phone exploded with messages. The HOA board wanted to schedule an emergency meeting about landscape preservation. The local historical society was demanding to review my garden plans. Even the neighborhood Facebook group was buzzing with debates about property rights versus historical preservation. James Cooper, my lawyer, wasn't surprised when I called him. "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," he explained. "The Historical Society, Engel is clever. They can tie you up in reviews and appeals while Linda moves forward with her pool plans." But Linda had overplayed her hand. That evening, Tom Wilson stopped by with a stack of old photographs. "Been holding onto these for years," he said, spreading them across my kitchen counter. "They show the original landscaping of every property in Maple Grove back when I first moved here, including Linda's lot. The photos were a gold mine. They clearly showed that Linda's own extensive landscaping had completely altered the historical character she was now so concerned about preserving. Her manicured lawn and imported Italian cypress trees were a far cry from the natural woodland setting captured in the old pictures. I scanned the photos and sent them to James, who responded immediately. "This is perfect. She's opened the door to her own past violations. Time to go on the offensive." The next morning, I woke to the sound of machinery. Looking out my window, I saw a huge truck parked in Linda's driveway. Workers were unloading what looked like sections of pool fencing. I called Officer Foster immediately. She arrived just as the workers were starting to lay out the fence sections, again, well into my property. "Mrs. Thompson," Officer Foster called out, "I believe you were warned about trespassing and unauthorized construction." Linda emerged from her house in a designer tracksuit, the picture of innocence. "Officer, these are just temporary panels for a safety demonstration. The pool company requires it for planning purposes." "Ma'am, you're placing structures on property that isn't yours," Officer Foster replied firmly. "This needs to stop now." The confrontation drew the attention of other neighbors. Maria Rodriguez had come outside and was recording everything on her phone. Even Grace Sullivan, Linda's faithful supporter, was watching with what looked like growing uncertainty. Linda's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. I've already invested thousands in this pool project. I had the designs custom made. For this space, Sarah is just being selfish and unreasonable. The only unreasonable person here is you, Linda," a new voice cut in. We all turned to see Kevin Thompson walking up the driveway, looking thoroughly exhausted. "This has gone too far. I've just been informed that the City Ethics Committee is launching an investigation into my involvement in this dispute." Linda's face went pale. "But Kevin, you promised you'd handle this. You said you could get the zoning board to—" "Stop talking, Linda," Kevin interrupted sharply. He turned to me. "Ms. Mitchell, I apologize for this situation. The fence contractors will remove everything immediately." But Linda wasn't finished. As the workers began packing up the fence panels, she rushed into her house and emerged minutes later with a thick folder. "I have proof," she announced, waving a stack of papers. "The previous owners signed an agreement giving us right of first refusal on any property adjustments. James Cooper, who I'd called as soon as I saw the fence delivery, chose that moment to arrive. He took one look at the papers Linda was brandishing and smiled. "Mrs. Thompson, even if such an agreement existed, which I doubt, it wouldn't be legally binding on a new owner. But please show me these documents. I'd be very interested in seeing when and how they were notarized." Linda's hand trembled slightly. They're somewhere in here. She began frantically flipping through papers. Kevin Thompson had seen enough. Linda, go inside. Now. Ms. Mitchell, I'll have my office send you a formal apology, and I'll personally ensure that all costs for property restoration and legal fees are covered. But as Linda stormed inside, slamming her door hard enough to make her precious Italian cypress trees shudder, I knew this still wasn't over. Through the window, I could see her already on the phone, pacing and gesturing angrily. She's calling Margaret from the Historical Society again, Maria confirmed, checking her phone. And apparently, there's an emergency meeting of the beautification committee tomorrow morning. James Cooper watched the scene with professional interest. You know, he said quietly, in all my years handling property disputes, I've never seen someone so determined to build a pool that they're willing to risk their husband's political career. Officer Foster was making notes in her official report. The chief isn't going to be happy about this. That's the third call to this address in as many days. I stood in my yard, surveying the mess left behind by the fence contractors. The property line dispute had evolved into something far bigger than I'd ever anticipated. Linda had tried using her husband's political connections, the Historical Society, and now apparently forged documents to get her way. As the crowd of neighbors gradually dispersed and the fence contractors packed up their last panels, I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda's next move would be even more dramatic. Someone willing to potentially compromise their husband's political career over a pool dispute wouldn't give up easily. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone, first with James Cooper to discuss our legal strategy, then with a security company to upgrade my camera system, and finally with David Chen to address the HOA's concerns about the situation. As the sun set, casting long shadows across my yard, I noticed Linda's silhouette in her upstairs window. She was on the phone again, gesturing animatedly. Even through the glass, I could see the determination on her face. Whatever she was planning. Next, I needed to be prepared. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought their connections and status put them above the law. Little did I know, Linda's next move would shock everyone in Maple Grove and force me to take actions I never thought I'd have to consider. A heavy fog had settled over Maple Grove as I reviewed the footage from my security cameras for what felt like the 100th time. Something about Linda's behavior over the past 24 hours seemed off. She'd been suspiciously quiet since Kevin's intervention with the fence contractors, and in my growing experience with Linda Thompson, quiet usually meant trouble brewing. My laptop pinged with an email notification from the city planning department. Apparently, someone had submitted an anonymous complaint about potential indigenous artifacts on my property. The email requested that I cease any ground-disturbing activities until a full archaeological survey could be conducted, a process that could take months. I immediately called James Cooper. "They're getting creative," he said, the sound of rustling papers coming through the phone. "I just received a similar notice. Someone also contacted the state's Historical Preservation Office about possible Revolutionary War-era burial sites in your backyard. Let me guess, these claims would conveniently prevent me from doing anything with my property while Linda proceeds with her pool plans?" I could feel a headache building behind my eyes. Exactly, but here's where it gets interesting. I did some digging. The archaeological claims were submitted through a private cultural resource management firm owned by none other than Margaret Whitman. The same Margaret from the Historical Society that Linda keeps calling? The very same. And guess who sits on the company's board of directors? Grace Sullivan's husband. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Linda was mobilizing her entire social network in an attempt to tie my hands through bureaucratic red tape. I glanced out my window to see Grace power walking past my house, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. It was Maria Rodriguez, looking concerned. "Sarah," "You need to see this." She handed me her tablet, open to the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Linda had posted a lengthy message about her concerns for neighborhood preservation and the need to protect property values from aggressive modern development. The comments section had exploded into a heated debate. Some neighbors supported Linda's calls for historical preservation, while others pointed out the hypocrisy of her own extensive property modifications over the years. The community was clearly divided. "That's not all," Maria continued, scrolling through her phone. Linda's scheduled an emergency meeting of the Historical Society for tomorrow morning. She's bringing in some expert to discuss the historical significance of the original property lines. I was about to respond when my security system alerted me to movement in the backyard. On the camera feed, I could see several people in business attire walking along my property line, taking photographs and soil samples. "I didn't authorize this," I said, already dialing Officer Foster's number. But before I could complete the call, an official-looking woman approached my front door, flanked by two men carrying scientific equipment. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Eleanor Richards from the State Historical Preservation Office. We're conducting an emergency assessment of potential historical resources on your property." I kept my door half closed, security chains still engaged. "Do you have a warrant or court order for this inspection?" Dr. Richards seemed taken aback by the question. "Well, no, but we received multiple reports of potentially significant historical features that could be impacted by proposed construction activities." Those reports wouldn't happen to have come from Linda Thompson, would they? The archaeologist shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the source of our information. However, given the potential sensitivity of the resources in question..." "I'm going to stop you right there," I interrupted, pulling up the property documents on my phone. "I have here the original environmental and cultural resource surveys conducted when this subdivision was built. They show no evidence of archaeological or historical resources. Furthermore, you're currently trespassing on private property without authorization." As if on cue, James Cooper's car pulled into my driveway. He stepped out, briefcase in hand, looking every bit the formidable lawyer he was. "Dr. Richards, I presume. I'm James Cooper, Ms. Mitchell's attorney. I believe we need to have a discussion about proper procedures for accessing private property." The archaeological team beat a hasty retreat, but not before I noticed Linda, watching from her upstairs window, phone pressed to her ear. She was already plotting her next move. I spent the afternoon in emergency consultations with James, developing a strategy to counter Linda's latest attacks. We were interrupted by a call from David Chen, the HOA president. "Sarah, I thought you should know. Linda's submitted a formal proposal to the HOA board to establish a historical character preservation zone that would cover both your properties. It would require joint approval for any exterior modifications." "She can't seriously think that will work," I said, but James was already pulling up the HOA bylaws on his laptop. "Actually, it's clever," he admitted. "The bylaws do allow for special overlay zones with a sufficient number of resident signatures. Linda's trying to create a legal framework that would give her veto power over your property." A commotion outside drew my attention. A news van had pulled up to the curb, and a reporter was setting up camera equipment. Linda emerged from her house, perfectly coiffed and dressed as if she'd been expecting them. "She called the media," Maria texted me. "Channel 5 is doing a story on neighborhood preservation versus modern development." I watched through my window as Linda gave her interview, gesturing dramatically toward my property. Her performance was Oscar-worthy. The concerned, long-time resident fighting to preserve the historical character of her beloved neighborhood from the encroachment of insensitive new development. The reporter and cameraman then approached my door. I declined to comment following James's advice, but I could already imagine how the story would be spun. Linda was making sure the court of public opinion would be on her side. As the news van drove away, I noticed more neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, discussing the situation in heated whispers. The community was becoming increasingly polarized. Tom Wilson approached my door, looking worried. "Sarah, you should know. Linda's arranged for a busload of historical preservation activists to attend tomorrow's Historical Society meeting. They're planning to protest any modifications to the historical landscape." I sank into my office chair, trying to process this latest development. Linda had transformed a simple property line dispute into a full-blown community crisis. She was playing every card she had: political connections, social influence, media manipulation, and now public protests. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You have no idea what you're up against. Just sell the house and move on." I showed it to James, who added it to his growing file of evidence. As evening fell, I noticed unusual activity at Linda's house. Multiple cars were parked in her driveway, and people were coming and going with stacks of papers and poster boards. Through my security cameras, I could see them setting up some kind of command center in her living room. "She's mobilizing for tomorrow's Historical Society meeting," Maria reported after doing some reconnaissance. "They're planning to present a petition with over 200 signatures demanding the preservation of the original neighborhood character." And I spent the night reviewing documents with James, preparing our response to each of Linda's allegations. The archaeological claims were easily disprovable, but the historical preservation angle was trickier. Linda had found a way to wrap her personal agenda in a cloak of community concern. Around midnight, my security cameras caught movement again. Linda and Grace were in the backyard with flashlights, taking photos and measurements. They were clearly planning something, but what? I got my answer early the next morning. As the sun rose over Maple Grove, I found my entire property line marked with historical preservation tape and small flags bearing the State Historical Society logo. Linda had effectively cordoned off my entire backyard as a potential historical resource. But she had made a crucial mistake. In her eagerness to mark the historical boundaries, she had inadvertently created physical evidence of her repeated trespassing. My security cameras had caught everything, and James was already preparing to use this latest intrusion in our growing legal case. As I watched Linda emerge from her house, dressed for battle in a crisp suit and carrying a thick binder of documents, I knew today would be decisive. The Historical Society meeting would either validate her claims and tie my hands with preservation restrictions, or expose her manipulation for what it was. Little did Linda know, I had a few surprises of my own planned for the meeting. Sometimes the best defense is a well-documented offense, and thanks to her increasingly aggressive tactics, I had plenty of documentation. The question was, would it be enough to finally end her campaign to steal my property for her pool? A line of cars began arriving at Linda's house, her supporters gathering for the pre-meeting strategy session. Through my window, I could see them reviewing presentations and rehearsing speeches. Linda had orchestrated quite a show, but she had overlooked one crucial detail that would soon come back to haunt her. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as I loaded the last of my documentation into my car. The Historical Society meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. at the Riverside Heights Community Center, a stately brick building that had once served as the town's first schoolhouse. James Cooper had agreed to meet me there early to review our strategy. One final time, as I pulled out of my driveway, I noticed an unusual amount of activity at Linda's house. Several cars I didn't recognize were parked along the street, and people were unloading what appeared to be display boards and presentation materials. Linda had clearly been busy rallying her troops. The community center parking lot was all ready. half full when I arrived. A small group of people wearing Save Our Heritage t-shirts were setting up a table near the entrance, complete with pamphlets and a petition for visitors to sign. I recognized Grace Sullivan directing them with military precision. Inside, I found James waiting in a quiet corner of the lobby, reviewing documents on his tablet. "You're going to want to see this," he said, showing me an email he'd received late last night. "Remember those archaeological claims? I did some digging into Dr. Richards' background." The email revealed that Dr. Eleanor Richards wasn't just any archaeologist, she was Linda's sorority sister from college. The emergency assessment had been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to lend credibility to Linda's historical preservation claims. "This helps us," James explained, "but Linda's got something bigger planned. My contact at the Historical Society says she submitted a formal application to have your entire property designated as a heritage conservation zone." Before I could respond, the double doors at the entrance swung open and Linda made her grand entrance. She was dressed in what appeared to be a carefully curated outfit, designed to evoke both authority and historical sensitivity. A vintage-inspired blazer paired with pearls that had probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Behind her came a parade of supporters, each carrying folders and tablets. I recognized several faces from the neighborhood, but others were clearly outsiders brought in to pad the numbers. Margaret Whitman from the Historical Society hurried to greet Linda with an enthusiastic hug. "Good turnout," James murmured, scanning the growing crowd. "But notice anything interesting about the sign-in sheet?" I looked at the registration table where attendees were checking in. Each person had to sign next to their address, and many of Linda's supporters were listing addresses well outside our neighborhood. The meeting room itself had been arranged like a small courtroom, with rows of chairs facing a raised platform where the Historical Society board would sit. Linda's team had already claimed the front rows, setting up their presentation materials with practiced efficiency. Maria Rodriguez slipped into the seat beside me, speaking in a low voice. "Sarah, you need to know, Linda's got professional preservationists from the state capitol here. She's trying to tie this to some bigger historical district initiative." The meeting began with Margaret Whitman calling for order. She explained that today's agenda would focus on preserving the historical integrity of our cherished neighborhood, carefully avoiding any mention of the pool dispute that had sparked this entire situation. Linda's presentation was masterful. I had to give her that. She'd created a compelling narrative about the neighborhood's historical significance, complete with sepia-toned photographs and testimonials from longtime residents. Not once did she mention her pool plans. Instead, she focused on the urgent need to protect our architectural heritage from modern encroachment. But then came the twist I hadn't expected. Linda introduced a special guest, Professor Albert Hammond, a renowned architectural historian from the State University. He began a lengthy presentation about the unique characteristics of post-Victorian suburban development, specifically highlighting the importance of maintaining original property configurations. Now, I felt my heart sink as he displayed aerial photographs of the neighborhood from the 1890s, pointing out how the original property lines had been designed to create a specific aesthetic effect. Linda sat in the front row, nodding sagely, while Grace Sullivan furiously took notes. James touched my arm gently, passing me a note. "Don't worry," it read, "wait for cross-examination." When Professor Hammond finished his presentation, Margaret Whitman opened the floor for questions. James stood up immediately, his expression pleasantly neutral. "Professor Hammond, fascinating presentation. Could you tell us when you first became interested in our specific neighborhood?" The professor shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I was contacted about this project quite recently. Would that be yesterday afternoon by any chance?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Hammond, Glanced at Linda, who was suddenly very interested in her phone. James continued, his voice still cordial. "And in preparing your presentation, did you have a chance to review the original subdivision plats from the county recorder's office?" "I worked with the materials provided to me by Mrs. Thompson." "I see. Would you be interested in seeing the actual historical records?" James held up a thick folder, including the original survey maps that show the current property lines exactly matching the historical boundaries. The room erupted in whispers. Linda stood up abruptly. "This is irrelevant. We're here to discuss preservation, not property disputes." But James was already approaching the presentation screen, documents in hand. "Actually, I think this is extremely relevant, especially considering that the only significant alterations to the original landscape in the past 20 years have been made by Mrs. Thompson herself." He displayed a series of aerial photographs showing the progression of Linda's property modifications, the removal of original trees, the installation of her Italian cypress garden, and most damning of all, the expansion of her patio that had actually encroached on her other neighbor's property line 5 years ago. Linda's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Those changes were all approved by the HOA." "Yes," James agreed smoothly. "Just like Ms. Mitchell's current property. Usage is fully approved. The difference is, she's not trying to claim additional land through dubious historical preservation claims." The mood in the room had shifted palpably. Even some of Linda's supporters were exchanging uncertain glances. Professor Hammond was quietly gathering his materials, clearly eager to distance himself from the situation, but Linda wasn't finished. She strode to the front of the room, waving a stack of papers. "I have here a petition signed by over 200 concerned citizens, demanding immediate action to protect our neighborhood's character." James was ready for this too. Would these be the same concerned citizens who live 50 miles away and were recruited through your social media preservation groups? Before Linda could respond, David Chen stood up from his seat in the back. "As HOA president, I feel compelled to point out that our bylaws specifically state that any community preservation initiatives must be supported by a majority of current residents, not outside activists." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Linda's supporters began arguing with other attendees. Professor Hammond tried to quietly slip out a side door, and Margaret Whitman frantically banged her gavel, calling for order. In the midst of the commotion, I noticed Kevin Thompson enter the room. He took one look at the scene, then walked straight to the front. "Linda," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Enough. This has gone too far." The room fell silent. Linda stared at her husband, betrayal written across her face. "Kevin, you promised you'd support me." "I supported you until you started manipulating historical preservation laws for personal gain. Do you have any idea how this looks? I'm already under investigation by the Ethics Committee." Grace Sullivan, apparently sensing the shifting winds, quickly began packing up her notes. Other supporters followed suit, leaving Linda standing, alone at the front of the room. Margaret Whitman cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess to..." But she was interrupted by new arrivals. Amanda Foster and another police officer entered the room, carrying official-looking documents. "Mrs. Thompson," Officer Foster announced, "we have a warrant to investigate allegations of fraud related to your historical preservation claims. We'll need you to come with us to answer some questions." The room erupted again, this time with people rushing to pull out their phones and record the scene. Linda stood frozen, her carefully crafted presentation forgotten on the podium. As the officers led Linda away, I caught a glimpse of Tom Wilson in the doorway, nodding slightly. He had been the one to file the fraud complaint, having kept detailed records of all of Linda's property modifications over the years. James gathered our materials calmly, as if this were just another day at the office. The Historical Society meeting was just a smokescreen, he explained quietly. The real issue was always about property fraud. Linda's attempts to manipulate preservation laws just gave us the evidence we needed. Outside, the Save Our Heritage table was already being packed up, the petition sheets abandoned in the morning breeze. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the community center's lawn, where Linda's supporters had stood so confidently just hours before. But this still wasn't over. As I watched Linda being driven away in the police car, I knew she would find another angle, another way to pursue her pool dreams. She had invested too much, gone too far to simply give up now. What I didn't know was that her next move would be so audacious, so completely unexpected, that it would leave the entire neighborhood questioning everything they thought they knew about Linda Thompson. Evening shadows stretched across Maple Grove as I sat in my home office, attempting to catch up on work I'd neglected during the morning's Historical Society drama. The neighborhood buzzed with activity. Small groups of residents gathered on corners, discussing the day's events in hushed tones. News vans had started appearing again, hoping to catch footage of Linda's eventual return from the police station. My security cameras picked up movement at the Thompson house around 6 p.m. Kevin's car pulled into the driveway, but Linda wasn't with him. He looked exhausted as he made his way inside, ignoring the reporters who rushed to catch a statement. Maria's text came through moments later. Linda's being held overnight. Apparently, they found something serious during questioning. I was about to respond when my doorbell rang. Through the security camera, I saw Grace Sullivan standing on my porch, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. She looked nothing like the confident woman who'd been directing Linda's supporters that morning. "Sarah," she said when I opened the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk. May I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside to let her enter. Grace perched nervously on the edge of my sofa, declining my offer of tea. "What I'm about to tell you, it goes beyond the property dispute." She opened her bag and pulled out a USB drive. "Linda, she's been planning this for years. The pool was just the beginning." The USB drive contained hundreds of documents, emails, architectural plans, and something called Project Paradise. As we reviewed the files, a stunning picture emerged. Linda had created an elaborate scheme to gradually acquire portions of surrounding properties through various means: legal pressure, historical preservation claims, and manufactured HOA violations. "She wants to build more than just a pool," Grace explained, scrolling through detailed blueprints. "She's planning a private resort-style complex. The pool was phase 1, then came the tennis courts, the spa pavilion, the entertainment center. And the plans showed a massive development that would consume nearly a quarter of the block. My property was just the first piece she needed." "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, studying Grace's face carefully. She twisted her wedding ring nervously. "Because my husband's architectural firm drew up these plans. If this gets out, his license could be in jeopardy, and Linda's been blackmailing several of us to help her." A knock at the door interrupted us. It was James Cooper, arriving for our scheduled evening meeting. His eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of Grace, but he quickly composed himself as we brought him up to speed. "This explains a lot," he said, examining the documents. "The historical preservation angle wasn't just about stopping your garden. It was about devaluing properties so she could acquire them cheaper." Grace nodded. "She's been monitoring real estate listings, waiting for certain homeowners to move. She's already submitted lowball offers on 2 other properties under different names." As we talked, my security system alerted me to unusual activity at Linda's house. Several cars had arrived, and people were hurriedly carrying boxes out to a waiting van. That's Margaret Whitman's car, Grace identified, peering at my security feed. And that's Linda's personal assistant. They're removing evidence. James was already on the phone with Officer Foster. Within minutes, police cars arrived, lights flashing, catching Margaret and the others in the act of removing documents from Linda's home office. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and document cataloguing. The removal attempt had given authorities probable cause for a more thorough search of Linda's property. What they found sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Hidden in a false bottom of Linda's filing cabinet was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, forged documents, manipulated property surveys, and detailed dossiers on various neighbors. She had been collecting compromising information on key community members, using it to pressure them into supporting her schemes. Tom Wilson arrived as the police were finishing their search, leaning heavily on his cane as he watched the scene unfold. "I knew she was up to something bigger," he said, shaking his head. "Been watching her operate for years. But this is something else." Around midnight, another car pulled into Linda's driveway. It was Kevin Thompson, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. "That's Senator Richardson," Grace whispered. "He's Kevin's mentor on the city council. This must be serious if he's involved." The senator barely made it to Linda's front door before the media descended. Camera lights illuminated the scene as reporters shouted questions. Kevin hurried inside while the senator faced the press. "In light of recent developments," he announced. Gravely, Councilman Thompson has submitted his resignation from the city council, effective immediately. He had no knowledge of his wife's activities and is cooperating fully with authorities. The media frenzy that followed was intense. News vans clogged the street, reporters knocked on every door in the neighborhood, and social media exploded with theories and accusations. Early the next morning, James called an emergency meeting at his office. Grace, Tom Wilson, Maria Rodriguez, and several other neighbors who had been involved in Linda's schemes gathered to share what they knew. Linda's being charged with multiple counts of fraud, attempted extortion, and conspiracy, James explained, spreading documents across his conference table. The district attorney is particularly interested in her connections to certain city officials. Grace spoke up, her voice stronger now. "She has files on everyone, bank records, personal emails, surveillance photos. She's been collecting dirt on anyone she thought might stand in her way." Maria pulled up an email on her phone. The HOA board just received her resignation letter. She's also withdrawing all pending complaints and preservation claims. As the implications of Linda's schemes sank in, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that her campaign to steal my property was over, but sadness for the community she had manipulated and divided. David Chen arrived late to the meeting, carrying more disturbing news. "The Historical Society's records have been audited. Linda apparently diverted thousands of dollars from preservation grants into private accounts. She used the money to fund her property acquisition plans." The scale of Linda's deception was staggering. What had started as a dispute over a pool had unraveled an elaborate web of fraud, manipulation, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. By afternoon, national news outlets had picked up the story. Reporters were calling it Poolgate, a suburban scandal that exposed the dark underbelly of seemingly perfect neighborhood politics. Kevin Thompson emerged briefly to collect some belongings, looking shell-shocked as he loaded boxes into his car. The proud politician who had once threatened to use his influence against me now couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Grace's husband, the architect who had drawn up Linda's grandiose plans, voluntarily reported himself to the state licensing board. Other professionals who had been caught in Linda's web began coming forward, each revelation adding new layers to the scandal. As I stood in my backyard that evening, Watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I thought about how differently things might have turned out if I had given in to Linda's initial demands. My simple desire to protect my property rights had exposed a conspiracy that had been years in the making. The property stakes still stood where they had always been, marking the true boundaries that Linda had tried so hard to blur. But the real boundaries she had crossed weren't physical. They were ethical, legal, and moral lines that had fractured our community. A movement caught my eye. Linda's Yorkshire Terrier Princess was pawing at our shared fence line, whimpering softly. Even the dog seemed to sense that something had fundamentally changed in our once peaceful neighborhood. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Breaking news. Federal investigators are now involved. This goes deeper than anyone imagined. As night fell over Maple Grove, police lights still flashing in front of the Thompson house, I realized that Linda's arrested wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a much larger investigation that would uncover corruption. At every level of local government, the morning fog clung to Maple Grove like a shroud as federal agents descended on our once quiet neighborhood. Black SUVs lined the streets, while agents in windbreakers marked FBI methodically searched the Thompson residence. The scene felt surreal, like something from a crime drama rather than suburban reality. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Various news outlets were requesting interviews, eager to hear from the neighbor whose property dispute had triggered this cascade of revelations. James Cooper had advised me to decline all media requests for now, warning that anything I said could potentially impact the ongoing investigation. A gentle knock at my door revealed Maria Rodriguez, clutching a manila envelope. "You need to see this," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I found it while cleaning out my attic this morning." Inside the envelope were photographs from a neighborhood gathering 3 years ago. They showed Linda in deep conversation with various city officials, including several faces I now recognized from news coverage of the developing scandal. But it was the background details that caught my attention. Detailed architectural drawings spread across a table, showing what appeared to be early versions of her Project Paradise plans. "Look at the date stamp," Maria pointed out. "This was taken before she started pressuring any of us. She'd been plotting this for years." We were interrupted by another knock. This time it was Agent Sarah Matthews from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. She was a sharp-featured woman with keen eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Ms. Mitchell," she began, showing her credentials, "we'd like to ask you some questions about Mrs. Thompson's activities, specifically about any interactions you had with city officials regarding your property dispute." For the next 2 hours, I walked Agent Matthews through every detail of my confrontations with Linda, from the initial property line dispute to the Historical Society meeting. Her particular interest was piqued by Kevin Thompson's involvement and his attempts to use his position on the city council to influence the situation. "What you experienced," Agent Matthews explained, "appears to be part of a much larger pattern of corruption and abuse of power. Mrs. Thompson's pool scheme was just the tip of the iceberg." As if to emphasize her point, another team of agents arrived at that moment to search Grace Sullivan's house. Grace stood on her front lawn, wringing her hands as they carried out boxes of documents. Her husband's architectural firm had apparently been involved in more than just Linda's pool plans. Tom Wilson hobbled over to my house around noon, his a face grave. "They're questioning everyone who served on the HOA board for the past 5 years, he reported. Apparently, Linda had been manipulating property values through selective enforcement of HOA rules. The investigation was revealing a complex web of corruption that extended far beyond our neighborhood. Linda had used her social connections and her husband's political influence to create a network of compromised officials and professionals who helped facilitate her schemes. David Chen arrived looking shell-shocked after his FBI interview. They showed me documentation proving that Linda had been bribing city inspectors for years, he said, collapsing into my porch chair. She had them deliberately overlook violations on properties she wanted to acquire, while strictly enforcing codes on others to drive down their value. The afternoon brought another surprise visitor, Michael Brooks, owner of the pool construction company Linda had tried to use for her project. He had come to apologize and provide additional evidence. She approached us 6 months ago, he explained, spreading contracts across my kitchen table. The plans she showed us were completely different from what she submitted to the city. She wanted us to begin construction secretly, planning to present it as a fait accompli once the work was underway. His documents revealed that Linda had created elaborate false permits and approvals, forging signatures of city officials she couldn't. Corrupt. The scope of her deception was breathtaking. Around sunset, a commotion drew everyone's attention to the Thompson house. Linda was being brought back for a supervised search of her home office. She looked nothing like the polished, confident woman who had tried to bully me just weeks ago. Her designer clothes had been replaced by prison orange, her carefully styled hair now limp and unkempt. Our eyes met briefly as they led her past my house. The mixture of hatred and defeat in her expression sent chills down my spine. Even now, in handcuffs, she radiated an aura of dangerous determination. The evening news painted an increasingly damning picture. Linda's scheme had apparently involved multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, and a complex network of bribes and blackmail. The investigation had expanded to include the state's Attorney General's office and federal prosecutors. Margaret Whitman from the Historical Society was the next to fall. FBI agents discovered that she had been helping Linda manipulate historical preservation regulations in exchange for kickbacks from development projects. The Historical Society's offices were now sealed with crime scene tape. As night fell, the federal agents set up floodlights around the Thompson property, continuing their search into the darkness. The harsh lights cast long shadows across our yards, transforming familiar landscapes into something alien and threatening. James Cooper called with updates from his legal contacts. They're finding evidence of similar schemes in other neighborhoods, he reported. Linda appears to have been running this operation across multiple jurisdictions. The prosecutors are talking about RICO charges. The mention of racketeering charges highlighted just how far this had escalated from a simple property dispute. What had started with Linda's attempt to steal part of my yard for a pool had exposed a criminal enterprise that spanned years and involved millions of dollars. Grace Sullivan appeared at my door again late that night, looking haunted. "They're offering plea deals," she whispered, "to anyone who can provide evidence against the main conspirators. I need to tell them everything I know." She spent hours with the FBI agents, detailing her role in Linda's schemes. As it turned out, Grace had been both accomplice and victim, helped by Linda in some ventures while being blackmailed over others. The next morning brought news crews from national networks, setting up their satellite trucks along our street. Our quiet suburban scandal had become headline news, with Linda being dubbed the pool shark by clever news writers. Kevin Thompson emerged briefly to address the media, reading a prepared statement about his ignorance of his wife's activities. But evidence was mounting that he had been more involved than he claimed. Bank records showed suspicious transfers coinciding with key zoning decisions he had influenced. By midday, the FBI had established a command center in the community hall, interviewing a steady stream of neighbors and local officials. The scale of the investigation was unprecedented in our town's history. Agent Matthews returned to update me on their findings. We've uncovered evidence that Mrs. Thompson was planning similar operations in 3 other neighborhoods, she explained. Your resistance to her initial attempt to take your property essentially prevented a much larger criminal enterprise from expanding. The irony wasn't lost on me. If I had simply given in to Linda's demands about the pool, her larger schemes might have continued unchecked. My stubbornness in protecting my property rights had inadvertently exposed years of corruption and fraud. As federal agents continued their methodical search of homes and offices throughout the neighborhood, I stood in my backyard, looking at the property line that had started it all. The simple wooden stakes marking my boundary had become the first dominoes in a chain reaction that was still toppling corrupt officials and exposing criminal conspiracies. A small group of neighbors gathered on my porch that evening, sharing information and piecing together the full scope of Linda's operations. Each person had a story, a strange interaction, an unusual request, a subtle threat that now made perfect sense in light of the investigation. The true impact of Linda's schemes was becoming clear. Beyond the criminal charges and legal consequences, she had damaged the very fabric of our community. Trust between neighbors had been broken, friendships strained, and the peaceful life we had all sought in Maple Grove had been fundamentally altered. But as we sat together, sharing stories and supporting each other through the investigation, I sensed something else emerging from the chaos. A stronger, more vigilant community, determined not to let anyone manipulate us again. The federal investigation was far from over, but one thing was certain: Linda's dream of building her private paradise had instead exposed a hidden hell of corruption and deceit. And our neighborhood would never be quite the same again. A light. Autumn rain fell over Maple Grove as moving trucks pulled up to the Thompson residence. Kevin Thompson had finally decided to sell the house, unable to bear the constant media attention and neighborhood scrutiny. Linda remained in custody, denied bail due to the extensive nature of her crimes and potential flight risk. The morning began with another surprise visit from Agent Matthews. She carried a thick folder stamped with federal seals, her expression grimmer than usual. "We've uncovered something disturbing in Mrs. Thompson's private records," she explained, spreading photographs across my kitchen table. "These show construction work being done on your property while it was still owned by the previous residents. The photos revealed workers installing what appeared to be underground infrastructure, pipes and electrical conduits that extended well beyond the Thompsons' property line. The timestamps showed the work being done late at night, just weeks before I purchased my home. She was laying the groundwork for her pool complex before you even bought the house," Agent Matthews explained. The previous owners were apparently pressured into allowing the work through a combination of bribes and threats. James Cooper arrived as we were examining the photos, bringing more revelations. The title search company that handled your purchase, they were in Linda's pocket. They deliberately overlooked these unauthorized modifications to your property. My stomach churned at the implications. Linda hadn't just targeted me after I moved in. I had been part of her plan all along. She had specifically waited for this property to go on sale, probably even influenced the previous owner's decision to sell. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. It was Emily Parker, my real estate agent, looking pale and nervous. "Sarah, I need to confess something. Linda approached me before you bought this house. She tried to get me to steer you away from the purchase. When I refused, she threatened to have my license revoked." The pieces were falling into place. Linda had attempted to control every aspect of the property transaction, and when that failed, she had resorted to more direct methods of claiming my land. Outside, the moving trucks were being loaded with the Thompsons' belongings. Grace Sullivan watched from her porch, clutching a cup of coffee with trembling hands. She had agreed to testify against Linda in exchange for immunity, and the stress was clearly taking its toll. Maria Rodriguez arrived with more documents she had discovered, old neighborhood association minutes that showed how Linda had systematically changed local regulations to facilitate her plans. Every amendment, every variance had been carefully crafted to serve her ultimate goal. Look at this. Maria pointed to a series of seemingly innocent changes to the HOA bylaws. She modified the rules about shared easements and common areas, creating loopholes she could exploit later. Tom Wilson hobbled over, bringing his own contribution to the investigation. "I found these in my old files," he said, producing a stack of yellowed photographs. "They show the original layout of all our properties before Linda started her modifications. The differences are subtle but telling." The federal investigation had expanded beyond our neighborhood. Agent Matthews revealed that similar schemes had been uncovered in other upscale communities across the state. Linda's network of corruption had tentacles reaching into multiple jurisdictions. Around noon, a sleek black car pulled up to the Thompson house. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit emerged, Linda's high-powered defense attorney. He spent several hours supervising the removal of specific items from the house, carefully documenting everything under the watchful eyes of federal agents. David Chen called an emergency HOA meeting to address the growing crisis. The community room was packed as he explained the steps being taken to review and reverse Linda's manipulations of neighborhood regulations. "We've discovered that many of our current HOA rules were quietly modified over the years," he explained, displaying documents on a projector screen. "Mrs. Thompson used her influence to make subtle changes that, when combined, gave her extraordinary control over property development in our neighborhood." The extent of Linda's manipulation became clearer as more residents came forward with their stories. She had created a complex web of modified regulations, unofficial agreements, and hidden infrastructure that would have eventually allowed her to force multiple homeowners into selling their properties. Michael Brooks, the pool contractor, provided additional details about Linda's ultimate plans. The architectural drawings found in her files showed not just a pool, but an entire private resort complex that would have consumed nearly a quarter of the neighborhood. She planned to acquire properties through various means: pressure, manipulation, selective enforcement of regulations, he explained. The pool dispute with Sarah was just the first visible move in a much larger game. As evening approached, another federal task force arrived, this one focusing on financial crimes. They set up operations in the community center, beginning a detailed audit of neighborhood property records and financial transactions. Grace Sullivan emerged from a lengthy interview with the Financial Crimes Unit looking shaken. "They showed me proof that Linda had been manipulating property assessments for years," she revealed. "She had contacts in the county assessor's office who would adjust values to suit her needs." The rain continued to fall as darkness settled over Maple Grove. The moving trucks had finished their work, leaving the Thompson house standing empty and dark. Kevin Thompson had departed quietly, refusing to speak to anyone as he drove away from the neighborhood for the last time. Agent Matthews returned with more questions about the underground infrastructure discovered on my property. "We need to bring in specialized equipment to map the full extent of these modifications," she explained. "There's concern about potential environmental violations." A team of environmental engineers arrived the next morning, setting up ground-penetrating radar equipment to survey the affected properties. Their findings were troubling. Linda had installed an extensive network of unauthorized utilities, presumably in preparation for her planned resort complex. James Cooper called an emergency meeting with all affected homeowners. "The good news is, we can use this evidence to build a civil case for damages," he explained. The bad news is, removing all this unauthorized infrastructure will be complicated and expensive. The media circus around our neighborhood showed no signs of abating. National news outlets had picked up the story, focusing on the broader implications of corruption in suburban development. Our quiet neighborhood had become a symbol of how wealth and influence could be used to manipulate entire communities. As I stood in my backyard, watching the environmental engineers map the hidden network beneath my feet, I couldn't help but marvel at the scale of Linda's ambition. What had started as a simple property dispute had uncovered a years-long conspiracy that had literally reshaped the ground under our homes. The federal investigation was expanding daily, with new revelations and arrests sending shockwaves through local government. Linda's network of corruption had reached far beyond our neighborhood, influencing zoning boards, inspection departments, and regulatory agencies across multiple jurisdictions. That evening, as the rain finally cleared and a cool breeze swept through Maple Grove, I sat on my porch with Maria and Tom, watching federal agents continue their methodical investigation of the Thompson property. The simple wooden stakes marking my property line still stood as silent witnesses to the conflict that had exposed this massive conspiracy. You know, Tom mused, in all my years here, I never imagined something like this could happen in our quiet little neighborhood. But maybe that's exactly why Linda chose this place. Who would suspect such elaborate schemes in such an ordinary setting? The next phase of the investigation would reveal even more shocking details about Linda's operations. But for now, we could only watch and wait as federal agents uncovered the full extent of her ambitious and ultimately failed attempt to build her private paradise on stolen land. Dawn painted the sky in muted shades of pink and gray as a team of forensic accountants arrived at the empty Thompson residence. Their black sedans formed a somber procession down Maple Drive, a stark contrast to the cheerful autumn decorations adorning neighboring homes. The investigation had entered a new phase, focusing on the complex financial web that had funded Linda's grandiose schemes. Agent Matthews met me at my front door, her expression unusually troubled. "We've found something in the offshore accounts," she said, stepping inside. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just planning a pool complex, she was setting up an elaborate money laundering operation. The document she spread across my kitchen counter told a stunning story. The proposed pool and resort complex would have served as a front for cleaning millions in questionable funds. Every amenity, from the planned spa to the underground parking structure, had been designed to conceal financial transactions. Emily Parker arrived mid-morning, carrying a thick folder of real estate records. "The pattern is clear now," she explained, laying out property histories. Linda targeted homes that had been in families for generations. She knew long-term owners would have less documentation about property boundaries and easements. The revelation cast our quiet neighborhood in a sinister new light. Every friendly gathering, every casual conversation at community events, had they all been opportunities for Linda to gather intelligence on potential targets? A commotion outside drew our attention. Two federal agents were escorting Margaret Whitman from her car to the command center. She had finally agreed to cooperate with investigators, and her testimony promised to reveal new layers of corruption. "The Historical Society was just a cover," Maria reported later after speaking with contacts at City Hall. Linda used preservation grants to funnel money into shell companies. Every historical designation, every preservation initiative had a hidden financial agenda. James Cooper arrived with more unsettling news. His legal team had uncovered evidence that Linda's schemes extended beyond our neighborhood. Similar patterns of property manipulation and regulatory corruption had been identified in 3 other upscale communities across the state. The afternoon brought another surprise visitor, Amanda Foster, who had been reassigned to a special task force investigating corruption in local government. We found links between Mrs. Thompson's activities and several cold cases involving suspicious property transfers, she explained. This has been going on for decades. Grace Sullivan watched the proceedings from her porch, her usual confidence, replaced by visible anxiety. The immunity deal she'd struck with prosecutors required her to reveal everything she knew about Linda's operations, and the toll of remembering was clearly wearing on her. As federal agents continued their methodical investigation of the Thompson property, environmental engineers made a disturbing discovery. The unauthorized infrastructure Linda had installed wasn't just for pool utilities. It included sophisticated surveillance equipment capable of monitoring activities throughout the neighborhood. Tom Wilson joined me on my porch, shaking his head at the scene. "All these years, I thought she was just being nosy with those binoculars," he mused. "Turns out she had a full surveillance operation running right under our feet." The scale of Linda's operation became clearer as more evidence emerged. The forensic accountants had traced financial connections to offshore accounts in 7 different countries. What had started as an ambitious plan for a private resort had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. David Chen called another emergency HOA meeting to address the growing crisis. The community room was packed as he detailed the steps being taken to audit every HOA decision made during Linda's influence. "We have to assume that every regulation, every variance, every property modification approved in the past 5 years might be compromised," he explained. Michael Brooks, the pool contractor, provided investigators with additional documentation about the planned construction. The blueprints revealed hidden rooms and passages that would have served no legitimate purpose in a residential pool complex. As evening approached, a series of black SUVs arrived at the command center. The FBI's Organized Crime Division had taken an interest in the case, suggesting connections to larger criminal networks. Agent Matthews briefed me on the latest developments. "Mrs. Thompson appears to have been working as a facilitator for various criminal enterprises," she explained. "The pool complex would have provided a legitimate-looking front for their operations." The implications were staggering. Our peaceful suburb had nearly become an unwitting host to a major criminal operation. All because one woman became obsessed with building a pool on her neighbor's property. Grace Sullivan emerged from another interview with federal agents, looking more distressed than ever. "They showed me photographs," she whispered, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "Meetings with people. Linda never told me who they really were." The investigation had begun to affect property values throughout the neighborhood. Real estate agents reported that potential buyers were backing out of deals, concerned about the implications of Linda's schemes. The dream homes of Maple Grove had become infamous for all the wrong reasons. James Cooper worked late into the night, coordinating with federal prosecutors. The case had grown far beyond a simple property dispute, evolving into what might become one of the largest suburban corruption cases in state history. As midnight approached, the forensic team made another significant discovery. Hidden in the Thompsons' home office walls, they found a cache of surveillance recordings. Linda had been documenting conversations and meetings for years, building a library of potential blackmail material. The next morning brought new federal agents, these specialists in cybercrime. The surveillance system Linda had installed was surprisingly sophisticated, capable of intercepting wireless communications throughout the neighborhood. Tom Wilson's photographs of neighborhood changes over the years took on new significance. What had seemed like normal community development now revealed a pattern of systematic manipulation, each change carefully orchestrated to serve Linda's ultimate plans. Maria Rodriguez organized a community support group, recognizing that many neighbors were struggling to process the betrayal. The peaceful suburb we'd all chosen for its tranquility had become ground zero for a criminal investigation that made national headlines. The environmental engineers expanded their survey, discovering that the unauthorized infrastructure extended far beyond initial estimates. Linda had created an underground network that could have supported operations far more extensive than a simple pool complex. As federal agents continued their investigation, more neighbors came forward with stories of subtle pressure and manipulation. Linda had spent years building her influence, using a combination of social engineering and outright intimidation to position herself for her ultimate scheme. The autumn leaves continued to fall, creating a colorful carpet over the investigation equipment dotting our yards. The simple property line dispute that had started this entire investigation seemed almost quaint now, overshadowed by the criminal enterprise it had exposed. Agent Matthews scheduled another briefing for affected homeowners. The scope of Linda's operation had expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations, touching every aspect of our community's development over the past decade. The media continued to circle our neighborhood, their satellite trucks becoming a familiar sight along Maple Drive. Our story had captured national attention, becoming a cautionary tale about corruption hiding in plain sight in America's suburbs. As night fell over Maple Grove, the floodlights from the command center cast long shadows across our yards. The peaceful community we'd all chosen for its tranquility had become the center of an investigation that would redefine suburban corruption. Cases for years to come. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick fog that had settled over Maple Grove, casting an ethereal glow over the federal command center. A new team of investigators had arrived overnight, specialists in digital forensics who were tasked with unraveling the electronic web of Linda's operations. My security cameras captured unusual movement at the empty Thompson house around 6 a.m. Several agents in protective suits were carefully removing computer equipment from a previously undiscovered room in the basement. Agent Matthews arrived at my door shortly after, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. "We found a complete command center hidden behind a false wall," she explained, showing me photographs on her tablet. Mrs. Thompson had access to surveillance feeds from throughout the neighborhood, including thermal imaging capabilities. The sophisticated nature of the equipment suggested connections to organizations far more dangerous than suburban property schemes. The FBI's counterintelligence division had taken an interest in the case, particularly in the origins of the surveillance technology. Grace Sullivan appeared at my door mid-morning, clutching a USB drive with trembling hands. "I found this in my husband's home office," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "It contains blueprints for similar operations in other communities." Linda was franchising her method. James Cooper arrived as we were reviewing the files. The implications were staggering. Linda had created a template for infiltrating and manipulating suburban communities, a method she planned to sell to other criminal enterprises. The neighborhood buzzed with activity as more investigators arrived. The environmental engineers had discovered something troubling beneath the Thompsons. Pristine lawn, a sophisticated bunker-like structure that appeared to have been designed as a control center for future operations. Maria Rodriguez organized an emergency meeting of concerned neighbors in my living room. The revelations about Linda's surveillance capabilities had everyone on edge. How many private conversations had she recorded? How many secrets had she collected? "The thermal imaging explains so much," Tom Wilson said, leaning heavily on his cane. "She always seemed to know when people were home, when they were sleeping, even when they were in their basements or attics." David Chen arrived with news from the HOA's legal team. They had discovered that Linda had been using advanced data analytics to predict which homeowners were most likely to sell, targeting properties crucial to her master plan. Michael Brooks, the pool contractor, provided additional context about the sophisticated nature of Linda's operation. The pool design wasn't just for show, he explained, spreading detailed blueprints across my kitchen counter. The entire structure was designed to house servers and surveillance equipment underwater, where thermal signatures would be masked. Amanda Foster brought in structural engineers to assess the stability of the underground installations. Their initial reports were concerning. Linda's secret modifications had compromised the geological integrity of several properties. The afternoon brought another shocking discovery. The forensic accountants had traced payments from Linda's accounts to a series of offshore companies specializing in private military contracting. The surveillance equipment in her command center matched specifications used in international intelligence operations. Agent Matthews coordinated with Homeland Security as the investigation expanded. Mrs. Thompson appears to have been developing a prototype for infiltrating and controlling residential communities, she explained. The question is, who was she planning to sell this system to? Grace Sullivan provided more context during her latest interview with federal agents. Linda had hosted several meetings with foreign investors, disguising them as innocent social gatherings. The pool complex was meant to be a demonstration project, proving the effectiveness of her methods. As evening approached, the digital forensics team made a breakthrough. Hidden in Linda's encrypted files were detailed psychological profiles of every resident in Maple Grove. She had been systematically gathering information about personal weaknesses, financial pressures, and family dynamics. James Cooper worked late into the night, coordinating with international law enforcement agencies. Linda's operation had connections to similar schemes in exclusive communities across multiple countries. The media circus intensified as news of the international connections broke. Satellite trucks lined Maple Drive as reporters competed to cover the story of suburban espionage that had captured global attention. Emily Parker brought property records showing how Linda had used her knowledge of resident psychology to time her acquisitions perfectly. She had created a pressure cooker environment, manipulating property values and community tensions to serve her purposes. The environmental engineers expanded their investigation to neighboring properties. The underground infrastructure was part of a larger network designed to support surveillance operations throughout the entire subdivision. Around midnight, another team of federal agents arrived, these specializing in counterterrorism. The sophistication of Linda's operation had raised concerns about potential national security implications. Margaret Whitman provided additional testimony about Linda's methods. The Historical Society had been used to create a database of property histories, identifying vulnerabilities in deeds and titles that could be exploited. The next morning brought more revelations. The forensic team discovered that Linda's surveillance operation had extended to monitoring electronic communications. Throughout the neighborhood, she had created a detailed map of relationships, conflicts, and potential leverage points. Kevin Thompson's political connections took on new significance as investigators uncovered links to international consulting firms specializing in social engineering and community manipulation. The autumn wind scattered leaves across the yards of Maple Grove, nature oblivious to the human drama unfolding beneath the suburban facade. Federal agents continued their methodical investigation, each discovery adding new layers to Linda's complex scheme. Grace Sullivan's immunity deal proved crucial as she revealed more details about Linda's operation. The pool dispute had been carefully orchestrated, designed to test the effectiveness of her property acquisition methods. The community gathered in my living room again, sharing information and supporting each other as more disturbing details emerged. Linda's surveillance had captured countless private moments, creating a vast database of potential leverage. Agent Matthews brought in specialists to sweep our homes for additional monitoring devices. The extent of Linda's electronic surveillance network exceeded anything they had encountered in suburban settings. As night fell, the floodlights from the command center illuminated the empty Thompson house, its dark windows reflecting the activities of federal agents still working to uncover the full scope of Linda's operation. The peaceful suburb we had, all chosen for its tranquility, had become ground zero for an investigation that would redefine our understanding of community manipulation and social engineering. James Cooper coordinated with international attorneys as the case expanded beyond national borders. Linda's methods had attracted interest from organizations specializing in community infiltration and control. The digital forensics team worked through the night, decrypting files that revealed the true scope of Linda's ambitions. She had developed a comprehensive system for identifying, infiltrating, and controlling residential communities. As the investigation continued, more neighbors came forward with stories of subtle manipulation and pressure. Linda had created an invisible web of influence, using personal information and psychological profiling to maintain control. The environmental engineers discovered that the underground infrastructure included provisions for expanding the surveillance network to adjacent neighborhoods. Linda's plans had extended far beyond Maple Grove. Agent Matthews scheduled another community briefing to address growing concerns about privacy and security. The sophistication of Linda's operation had raised questions about vulnerability in suburban communities nationwide. The media continued to swarm our neighborhood, their presence a constant reminder of how our quiet community had become the center of an international investigation into suburban espionage and manipulation. As the moon rose over Maple Grove, casting silver light across the investigation equipment dotting our yards, I couldn't help but marvel at how a simple property dispute had exposed a sophisticated operation designed to exploit the trust and vulnerability of suburban communities. The peaceful neighborhood we had all chosen for its sense of community had become a case study in how that very sense of community could be weaponized by those with the right tools and knowledge. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new investigators, and new questions about the true nature of suburban life in an age of surveillance and social engineering. But for now, we could only watch and wait as federal agents continued to unravel the complex web Linda had woven through our once peaceful community. The crisp morning air held a sense of finality as federal agents began dismantling their command center outside the Thompson residence. 6 weeks had passed since the initial discovery of Linda's surveillance operation, and the investigation had reached its conclusion. The peaceful autumn that had begun with a simple property dispute had transformed our suburban community forever. Agent Matthews arrived at my door for the last time, carrying a thick manila envelope. "The grand jury has returned their indictments," she announced, spreading the documents across my kitchen table. 47 counts against Mrs. Thompson, including racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud, and violations of national security protocols. Linda's elaborate scheme had crumbled completely. The forensic accountants had traced over $30 million through her network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The sophisticated surveillance system she had installed throughout Maple Grove was valued at nearly $12 million alone, with technology that exceeded military-grade specifications. Grace Sullivan sat in my living room, finally free to share the full story. "She approached my husband 5 years ago," she explained, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. "The pool was never meant to be just a pool. It was supposed to be the control center for operations across multiple communities. She called it Project Paradise, a template for infiltrating and manipulating affluent neighborhoods. James Cooper arrived with the final settlement papers. The civil suits against Linda and her conspirators had been resolved, with substantial compensation awarded to affected homeowners. The unauthorized infrastructure would be removed, the surveillance equipment destroyed, and properties restored to their original condition. Maria Rodriguez organized one last community meeting in my living room. The neighbors who gathered were different from the frightened, suspicious group that had first learned of Linda's schemes. They had emerged stronger, more united, determined to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Tom Wilson shared photographs from his decades in the neighborhood, helping us remember the community we had been before Linda's influence. "We can't let her destroy what makes this place special," he said, his voice firm despite his age. "We're more than just her victims. We're the ones who exposed her operation." David Chen presented the new HOA guidelines, completely rewritten to prevent future manipulation. Every regulation had been reviewed, every procedure scrutinized to ensure transparency and accountability. The changes would serve as a model for other communities nationwide. The environmental engineers provided their final report. The removal of Linda's underground infrastructure would take months, but they had developed a comprehensive plan to restore the geological stability of affected properties. The sophisticated bunker beneath the Thompson house would be carefully dismantled, its high-tech components catalogued and secured by federal authorities. Michael Brooks, the pool contractor, had become a key witness in the federal case. His testimony revealed how Linda had attempted to create a network of compromised construction companies, each ready to assist in her community infiltration schemes. Amanda Foster brought news from the prosecutor's office. Linda had finally agreed to a plea deal, facing a minimum of 25 years in federal prison. Kevin Thompson had also pleaded guilty to lesser charges, accepting a 10-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation. The media interest had finally begun to fade, the satellite trucks departing one by one as the story of suburban espionage reached its conclusion. Our quiet neighborhood would return to the peace we had originally sought, though forever changed by our experience. Margaret Whitman's testimony had proven crucial in understanding the scope of Linda's operation. The Historical Society's records had been used to create detailed profiles of community vulnerabilities, identifying targets for manipulation and control. Emily Parker helped coordinate the restoration of property values, working with real estate experts to rebuild confidence in our neighborhood. The publicity surrounding the case had initially devastated the market, but the story of community resilience had begun to attract a new kind of buyer, people drawn to our demonstrated strength and unity. The digital forensics team completed their analysis of Linda's surveillance data. All recorded information would be securely destroyed, protecting the privacy of residents who had been unknowingly monitored for years. The sophisticated algorithms she had developed for predicting and manipulating community behavior would be studied by law enforcement agencies, helping prevent similar schemes in the future. Grace Sullivan's immunity deal had opened doors for investigators across the country. Similar operations had been discovered in 3 other states, each following Linda's template for community infiltration. Her cooperation had helped prevent countless other neighborhoods from falling victim to the same sophisticated manipulation. As evening approached on this final day of the investigation, neighbors gathered on my front porch. The property stakes that had started this entire saga still stood, no longer symbols of conflict, but reminders of how one person's determination to protect their rights had exposed a criminal enterprise. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves as Agent Matthews said her goodbyes. The federal presence that had become so familiar in our community was finally ending, leaving us to rebuild and recover on our own. James Cooper provided one last piece of advice as he prepared to close our case files. The experience of Maple Grove would become a case study in community resilience and the importance of remaining vigilant against sophisticated manipulation. The setting sun cast long shadows across our yards as the last federal vehicles departed. The Thompson house stood empty, its dark windows no longer hiding secrets and surveillance equipment. Soon it would be sold, offering another family the chance to become part of our renewed community. Maria Rodriguez suggested a neighborhood celebration, not to mark the end of the investigation, but to celebrate our survival and unity. The planned gathering would be the first of many steps in rebuilding the trust and connections that made our community special. As night fell over Maple Grove, stars emerging in the clear autumn sky, I stood in my backyard one last time. The property line that Linda had tried to steal for her pool now represented something far more significant: the boundary where one person's stand against injustice had exposed and defeated a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The peaceful suburban life we had all sought in Maple Grove would return, though forever changed by our experience. We had learned valuable lessons about community, vigilance, and the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.